I was sitting at the head table holding a champagne flute that looked exactly like everyone else's, listening to the low hum of conversation bounce around the room. The band was between sets. Plates had just been cleared. It was that brief, quiet pocket at a wedding where nothing is supposed to go wrong. That's when I saw my sister's hand move. Not dramatically, not rushed. Just a small, careful shift to the left, like she was straightening something that didn't need fixing. Her shoulder angled slightly toward me. Her body blocked the view from anyone standing nearby. And in that half second, something clear slipped from her fingers into my drink. No splash, no color change, just a soft ripple in the champagne. I didn't react. That wasn't instinct. That was training. Years in the Navy teach you that the most dangerous moments are never loud. They're quiet. Ordinary. The kind you miss if you're busy smiling for photos. I kept my face neutral and let my eyes move instead. I watched her pull her hand back. I watched her glance at my glass, then away. I watched the corner of her mouth tighten just slightly, like she was pleased with herself. My own wedding was unfolding exactly as planned around us. White tablecloths, polished silverware, family friends laughing too loudly after a few drinks. Ethan, my husband, leaned in close and whispered something about his uncle already asking where the bar was. I laughed because that's what brides do. But my focus stayed on that glass. I didn't pick it up. I didn't sniff it. I didn't stare at it like something out of a crime show. I just sat there, hands folded, breathing steady, letting my brain catch up to what my eyes had already confirmed. My sister had just put something in my drink. If you're wondering why I didn't immediately flip out, stand up, or call her out in front of everyone, the answer is simple. I've known my sister my entire life, and I've learned that reacting is exactly what she counts on. Her name is Brielle. She's 4 years younger than me, louder than me, and has always had a talent for making herself the center of any room without doing much to earn it. Growing up, if something broke, it was somehow my responsibility to understand why she'd done it. If she messed up, I was told to be the bigger person. If she cried, everyone moved. I learned early that staying calm didn't mean staying safe. It just meant staying quiet. That pattern didn't change when I joined the military. If anything, it got sharper. In uniform, I was trusted, given responsibility, taught to notice small deviations and assume intent until proven otherwise. At home, I was still the reliable one, the one who could handle it. So when I saw her do that, my first thought wasn't shock. It was clarity. I didn't know exactly what she'd put in my drink. I didn't need to. Whatever it wasn't meant to help me. I shifted slightly in my chair and finally let myself look at her directly. She was talking to someone across the table, laughing too hard at something that wasn't funny. Her voice carried. She always made sure it did. But her eyes flicked back to my glass again, quick and sharp, like she was checking a timer. That's when it clicked. She wasn't just trying to mess with me. She was waiting for me to drink it. The band started tuning up again. Chairs scraped softly against the floor as people adjusted. Someone clinked a fork against a glass in the distance, testing the sound. Toasts were coming soon, that part of the night where everyone pays attention. I rested my fingertips on the base of my champagne flute. The glass was cool, untouched, still full. Brielle leaned closer. "You okay?" She asked, her tone sweet enough to fool anyone who didn't know her. "Perfect," I said. And I meant it in a way she didn't understand. Because in that moment, I realized something else. This wasn't a joke gone too far. This wasn't jealousy spilling over into something careless. This was planned. Controlled. She'd waited for the exact moment when no one was watching closely, when everyone assumed nothing bad could happen. She'd chosen my wedding. I glanced around the room, taking in details the way I always do when something feels off. The servers were clustered near the bar, waiting for a cue. The photographer was busy with a group shot near the dance floor. Most of the guests were turned toward the band, not us. No one was paying attention to the head table, except her. My phone buzzed once against my thigh. I didn't pull it out yet. I already knew who it would be. There were only a few people in that room who watched the way I did. I let my hand drop back into my lap and turned my attention to Ethan, who was smiling at something his mother had just said. The room felt normal, loud, warm. Exactly the kind of place where people assume they're safe. I waited. If you're watching this and you're already thinking, why didn't you just switch the drinks right? Then hold that thought. There's a reason timing matters, and there's a reason I didn't move yet. But before I go any further, if this kind of real family drama and quiet revenge story is your thing, take a second to drop a comment below and hit subscribe. I share stories like this because they happen more often than people admit, and sometimes seeing how someone else handled it helps you see your own situation more clearly. Brielle lifted her own glass, swirling it slightly, her eyes still flicking toward mine. She looked relaxed, confident, like she'd already won something. I finally checked my phone. One short message, 5 words. She put something in it. I didn't reply. I looked back up at my sister, still smiling, still waiting for me to make the mistake she'd planned for. And for the first time all night, I felt completely steady. Because whatever she thought was about to happen, she was wrong about one thing. I wasn't the only one paying attention. The phone stayed warm in my hand for a second longer before I slipped it back into my lap and let my shoulders relax like nothing had changed. From the outside, I probably looked like a bride enjoying her reception. Inside, my mind had already shifted into a familiar mode. In the Navy, we call it situational awareness. It's not panic. It's not suspicion. It's the quiet habit of noticing what doesn't belong and deciding what matters most in that moment. I didn't grow up in a military family. I joined because I needed structure, distance, and a place where rules actually meant something. Boot camp stripped away the idea that emotions deserve immediate reactions. You learn to pause, to collect information, to act when it counts, not when it feels good. That training doesn't shut off just because you're wearing a wedding dress. I glanced around the room again, slower this time, letting my eyes move instead of my head. The band was finishing their sound check. The servers were lining up near the kitchen doors, waiting for the signal to start pouring again. My parents were laughing at something my aunt said, completely unaware of anything happening 2 feet away from their oldest daughter. Ethan leaned back in his chair and stretched his arm across the back of mine. His hand landed on my shoulder, light and familiar. "You sure you don't want another drink?" he asked casually. "Maybe in a minute," I said. It was an easy answer. Normal. He nodded and turned back to the conversation. No suspicion, no concern, exactly how it should be. The truth is, I'd spent years learning how to keep my voice steady when things weren't. My job demanded it. You don't get far in uniform if you fall apart every time something feels wrong. You assess, you adapt, you choose. I thought back to my first deployment, standing in a briefing room that smelled like stale coffee and recycled air, listening to someone explain a situation that was already changing. One of the senior officers had said something that stuck with me. If you wait for proof, you've already lost time. That line came back to me now, clear as day. I didn't need a lab test to know my sister hadn't dropped vitamins into my champagne. I didn't need to taste it. I didn't need confirmation beyond what I'd already seen and what my phone had confirmed. What I needed was patience. Brielle shifted in her seat and leaned closer to me again. "They're about to start the toast," she said, nodding toward the band leader, who was stepping up to the mic. "You excited?" Her voice was bright, practiced. She'd always been good at sounding supportive when it suited her. "Yeah," I said, "I am." And I was. Just not for the reason she thought. Growing up, Brielle had learned a different kind of strategy. Where I learned to wait, she learned to push. Where I learned consequences, she learned that someone else would clean up the mess. It wasn't her fault entirely. Our parents had reinforced it for years. She cried, they rushed in. I stayed quiet. They assumed I could handle it. The military was the first place where that dynamic didn't exist. No one cared who cried louder. Results mattered, choices mattered. And if you crossed a line, you owned it. That contrast had reshaped me in ways my family never noticed. They still saw the older sister who would smooth things over, make excuses, keep the peace. They hadn't seen the version of me who learned to sit with discomfort and let a situation unfold. The band leader tapped the microphone, testing the sound. A brief squeal of feedback rippled through the room, then faded. Conversations softened. Chairs turned. The attention of the room slowly shifted forward. Brielle straightened, smoothing the front of her dress. She glanced at her reflection in the polished silverware, then at me. Her eyes flicked to my glass again. Still full, still untouched. There it was, that tiny tightening at the edge of her smile. She was waiting for a sign, a sip, a stumble, something to confirm that her plan was moving forward. I rested my palm flat on the table, close enough to my glass to move it if I needed to, but not yet. Timing mattered. I'd learned that too. Acting too soon draws attention. Acting too late costs you control. Another memory surfaced uninvited. A training exercise gone wrong because someone had rushed instead of watching. The debrief afterward had been brutal. No yelling, just silence followed by consequences. That kind of accountability changes how you think. I let out a slow breath through my nose and felt my heartbeat settle. The noise in the room faded into the background. All that existed was the table, the glasses, and the woman beside me who thought she was smarter than everyone else. The band leader cleared his throat. "All right, folks," he said into the mic. "If I could have your attention for just a moment." Brielle's shoulders squared. She picked up her glass and held it loosely, like it was nothing more than a prop. She didn't drink yet. She was saving that. I noticed something else then. Her hand wasn't steady. Not shaking exactly. Just a faint tension in her fingers, like someone holding onto a secret that's starting to feel heavier than expected. My phone buzzed again, once against my leg. I ignored it this time. I already had what I needed. Ethan leaned in closer. "You good?" he murmured, his voice low. I nodded. "I'm good." And that was true in a way it hadn't been earlier. Because the moment I recognized what was happening, the fear disappeared. Fear lives in uncertainty. Training lives in clarity. And clarity had finally caught up with me. Brielle lifted her glass a little higher, readying herself for her role. Around us, the room was settling into that quiet attention that comes before someone speaks. Every face turned forward. Every assumption intact. I didn't move my glass yet. I didn't need to. Not until the room was fully watching. Not until her confidence had settled into place. I watched her out of the corner of my eye, calm, focused, letting her believe everything was unfolding exactly the way she planned. I kept my eyes on the table as the room settled, but my mind drifted somewhere else entirely and back to a pattern that had been running long before this wedding ever existed. Brielle didn't become the way she was overnight. She was built, slowly, carefully, by a family that confused love with indulgence and peace with avoidance. When we were kids, the difference between us was obvious, even before either of us could explain it. If I forgot my homework, it was a lesson. If Brielle forgot hers, it was a misunderstanding. If I got upset, I was told to calm down. If she cried, everyone stopped what they were doing. I learned early that staying quiet made things easier. Not better. Easier. By high school, the roles were locked in. I was the responsible one. The safe bet. The kid teachers praised and parents bragged about in vague terms. Brielle was the one with potential, which seemed to excuse everything she didn't follow through on. When I left for the Navy, the dynamic didn't change. It just stretched across distance. I called home from training bases and deployments, hearing the same stories in different packaging. Brielle dropped out of another program. Brielle needed help with rent. Brielle was going through something, and everyone needed to be understanding. Understanding was always my job. I sent money more than once. Not because anyone asked directly, but because the silence afterward made it clear what was expected. If something went wrong for her, it somehow reflected on me for not stepping in. The irony is that my parents liked telling people their daughter was in the military. They just didn't like what it required of them. Pride from a distance, discomfort up close. My discipline made them uneasy. It didn't fit their version of family harmony. Brielle, on the other hand, fit perfectly. Loud, emotional, unpredictable enough that everyone tiptoed around her moods. She learned that if she pushed hard enough, someone else would bend. I didn't realize how much of that I'd internalized until Ethan came into my life. He noticed things I'd stopped questioning. The way conversations shifted when Brielle walked in. The way my parents' voices softened for her and sharpened for me. The way excuses came preloaded whenever her name came up. Once after a family dinner that ended with Brielle storming out over something minor, Ethan asked me why everyone acted like that was normal. I didn't have an answer. I just shrugged and said, "That's how it's always been." He didn't argue. He just looked at me like someone seeing a crack in something I'd always assumed was solid. The engagement made that crack impossible to ignore. When Ethan proposed, my parents were happy. Genuinely. But their excitement came with conditions. Brielle needed to feel included. Brielle needed a role. Brielle needed reassurance. The conversation shifted almost immediately from my future to her feelings about it. She reacted exactly the way I should have expected. At first, she was overly enthusiastic, too supportive, asking too many questions about venue's guest lists and photos. Then the comments started slipping through. "You're really okay with all that attention," she'd say. Or, "That kind of crowd can be intimidating if you're not used to it." Small things, easy to dismiss, designed to land quietly. I brushed them off because that's what I always did. I told myself she was insecure, that she needed time, that it wasn't worth the fight. Standing there now, watching her cradle that champagne flute, like it was a harmless accessory, I realized how predictable that thinking had been. People don't suddenly cross lines they've been allowed to approach for years. The bandleader finished his brief announcement and stepped aside. The microphone stood empty for a moment, humming softly. A few people clapped, assuming the first speaker would step up soon. Brielle adjusted in her chair, clearly enjoying the attention even before it was officially hers. She leaned toward me again, lowering her voice. "I'm really glad you let me do this," she said. "It means a lot." I turned my head just enough to meet her eyes. I know. That wasn't reassurance. It was acknowledgement. She smiled satisfied and looked forward again. Her confidence didn't come from talent or preparation. It came from history, from knowing that no matter what she did, the family would scramble to explain it away. That confidence was exactly what made her careless. I let my gaze drift toward my parents. My mother was already holding her phone ready to record. My father sat back in his chair, relaxed like nothing in this room could possibly surprise him. They trusted the script. They always had. I wondered briefly what they would do if that script fell apart. The thought didn't make me angry. It made me tired. Brielle lifted her glass slightly, testing the weight. She glanced sideways at mine again. Still full, still untouched. There it was, that flicker of impatience. She'd built this moment in her head. The part where I'd drink, where something would go wrong, where attention would swing away from her in the most satisfying way possible. She didn't want to hurt me quietly. She wanted an audience. That's what separated this from every other small betrayal I'd swallowed over the years. This wasn't thoughtless. It was performative. The microphone crackled as someone adjusted the volume. A few heads turned toward the head table. The room's focus narrowed. I felt an unexpected calm settle over me. Not relief, not excitement. Just the steadiness that comes when a long-standing question finally answers itself. I'd spent years wondering how far Brielle would go if no one stopped her. I had my answer now, and for the first time I understood something else just as clearly. Protecting her had never kept the peace. It had only delayed the moment she'd prove who she really was. Brielle stood smoothing her dress glass in hand. A few people clapped reflexively. She smiled wide, soaking it in, stepping toward the microphone, like the space belonged to her. I didn't move. I didn't reach for my drink. I didn't warn anyone. I just watched her take her place, confident, composed, absolutely certain that history was on her side. The applause followed her halfway to the microphone, polite and automatic, the kind people give before they've decided how much they care. I watched Brielle take it in, shoulders back, chin lifted like she'd practiced this moment in a mirror more than once. Seeing her there pulled me backward to the first night. Everything shifted months before the wedding, before the planning calls, before the champagne flutes ever touched the table. Ethan had proposed on a quiet evening at home. No crowd, no cameras, just the two of us and a question that didn't need an audience. I said yes without hesitation. For once, my life felt straightforward. Telling my family should have been easy, it wasn't. My parents were happy in the way people are happy when something fits their idea of success. Ethan had the right background, the right career path, the right bearing. They congratulated me, hugged me, and immediately started talking logistics. Brielle's reaction came later. She didn't answer my first call, or the second. When she finally responded, it was with a string of enthusiastic messages that felt oddly delayed, like someone rehearsing excitement they didn't feel yet. "So happy for you. This is huge. I can't wait to be part of it." At the time, I took it at face value. I shouldn't have. The first comment slipped out at a family dinner a week later. We were sitting around the table, Ethan beside me, when Brielle laughed and said, "Wow, I never thought you'd go for someone so... official." Official! The word lingered. Ethan smiled politely. I ignored it. After that, the remarks came in pieces. Always small, always easy to brush aside. Questions about whether I'd be comfortable around Ethan's colleagues. Jokes about me needing help with social stuff. Comments framed as concern that somehow always landed as doubt. I noticed, I just didn't challenge them. The engagement made something else clear too. Brielle wasn't just jealous of me. She was threatened by what the engagement represented. Stability, respect, a life built on consistency instead of attention. That kind of contrast makes some people uncomfortable. For Brielle, it was intolerable. She inserted herself into the planning early. Too early. Volunteering opinions before being asked. Offering to help with things that didn't need fixing. When I didn't hand over control, her tone changed. "You're being kind of rigid about this," she said, once smiling like she was doing me a favor. "Weddings are supposed to be fun." Fun, apparently, meant letting her decide how things looked. My parents backed her up without realizing they were doing it. Or maybe they realized and didn't care. They told me she just wanted to feel included, that she was sensitive, that it wouldn't hurt to compromise. So I did. Again, I let her choose her role. I let her weigh in on things that mattered more to her image than my comfort. I kept telling myself that this was temporary, that once the wedding was over, things would settle. But pressure doesn't disappear when you ignore it. It just finds another way out. The first time Ethan noticed the shift in her behavior was after a planning dinner that ended with Brielle criticizing the guest list. She said it casually, like she was making conversation. "Do you really need all those people from work?" she asked. "It might feel a little... stiff." Ethan didn't respond right away. He waited until we were alone before asking me why she seemed so invested in undermining everything. I told him she didn't mean it like that. Even as I said it, I knew how practiced the line sounded. That was the pattern. She pushed. I softened it. Everyone else moved on, until she started making it clear that she wanted something else entirely. She wanted visibility, not just as my sister, as a figure, someone attached to the event in a way that made people notice her. She talked about photos more than vows, about who would be watching instead of why they were there. I should have seen where that was heading. By the time the invitations went out, her comments had sharpened. She didn't hide her irritation when conversations centered on Ethan's family or my career. She laughed a little too loudly when someone mentioned deployments. She rolled her eyes when people thanked me for my service. "Must be nice having everyone impressed by a uniform," she said once, right in front of him. I remember Ethan's jaw tightening. I remember the silence that followed. And I remember my mother stepping in quickly, changing the subject like always. Brielle learned something in that moment. She learned that even when she crossed a line, someone else would smooth it over. That knowledge emboldens people. So when I saw her standing there now, glass in hand, ready to speak, I wasn't surprised by what she'd tried to do earlier. I was surprised it hadn't happened sooner. She adjusted the microphone, tapping it lightly, then laughed when the sound echoed too loudly. The room responded with a chuckle. She had them. That was always easy for her. "I guess that works," she said, smiling wide. I watched her posture settle into something confident and rehearsed. She'd planned this. The tone, the pacing. The moment she'd become part of the story instead of standing next to it. Her eyes flicked toward me one more time. Not concern, not affection, assessment. She needed to know whether I'd taken that drink. I met her gaze without giving her anything back. Behind her, the room waited. Friends, family, colleagues. People who believed they were about to hear something heartfelt and harmless. They didn't know what had already happened. They didn't know what she'd done to get here. And they didn't know how much that engagement than my engagement had unraveled her sense of control. Brielle lifted her glass slightly, ready to begin the weight of it steady in her hand. She smiled into the microphone, soaking in the attention, convinced she was about to take center stage in a story she'd rewritten in her favor. I sat back in my chair, hands resting calmly in my lap, feeling the quiet certainty that comes when someone mistakes familiarity for immunity. Because jealousy doesn't always explode, sometimes it plans. The glass felt heavier than it should have when Brielle lifted it, and that tiny detail pulled my focus back to everything I'd brushed off in the months leading up to this night. None of what she was doing now came out of nowhere. I'd just gotten used to explaining it away. There were moments during the planning that made my instincts twitch the same way they do before a briefing that's missing key information. Small things. Easy to dismiss if you want peace more than clarity. Like the afternoon she insisted on joining me for a final meeting with the coordinator, even though she hadn't been involved before. She sat there scrolling through her phone, barely listening until the conversation turned to the reception timeline. "So when do the speeches happen?" she asked, suddenly alert. The coordinator explained the order. Brielle nodded, then smiled at me. "That's perfect. Perfect for what I didn't ask." Or the time she offered to handle the champagne delivery so I wouldn't have to think about it. I remember pausing, wondering why she cared about something so minor. I thanked her and told her the venue already had it covered. She looked disappointed, not annoyed. Disappointed, like a door had quietly closed. Another red flag came during the rehearsal dinner. She'd had one glass of wine too many and leaned over to whisper, "You know, people expect brides to loosen up at their own wedding." I laughed it off. "I think I'll manage." She shrugged, "Just saying." At the time, it sounded like advice. Now it sounded like testing a boundary. There was also the way she kept positioning herself near me whenever drinks were involved, refilling glasses that weren't empty, offering to grab something even when servers were right there. It never crossed into obvious interference. It stayed just shy of suspicion. That's how she operated, always one step below where anyone would call her out. Ethan noticed some of it. He didn't push, but he started watching her more closely. Once, after she'd insisted on making a toast at a pre-wedding gathering, he leaned in and said, "She really likes the microphone." I smiled and said, "That's just Brielle." It was easier to say that than admit I didn't fully trust her anymore. The truth is, ignoring red flags becomes a habit when you're raised to prioritize someone else's comfort. You stop asking why something feels off and start asking how to smooth it over. That habit almost cost me. At the head table now, the room quieting around us, I felt a strange mix of regret and relief. Regret for not trusting myself sooner. Relief that I had at least trusted myself now. Brielle adjusted her grip on the glass and leaned slightly toward the microphone, but she didn't speak yet. She was waiting for the room to fully settle, for every eye to be on her. She'd learned that timing trick somewhere. Wait until attention peaks, then deliver. I shifted in my chair, letting my knee brush against the table leg. The glass in front of me caught the light bubbles still rising untouched. It looked harmless. That was the point. My phone buzzed again. I didn't need to check it to know it was the same person. Someone who had seen what I saw. Someone who understood what it meant. I slid the phone deeper into my lap and focused on the tablecloth, instead tracing the pattern with my eyes. Breathing in, breathing out. Another memory surfaced. A conversation with a senior officer years ago after I'd flagged a minor issue that others had dismissed. He'd listened, then said, "If something feels off, it usually is. People just don't like hearing it." I wondered how many times I'd ignored that advice when it came to my family. Brielle laughed softly into the microphone, testing it again, then glanced around the room like she was counting heads. She hadn't said a word yet, but she already had them leaning in. Her confidence was built on assumptions that I'd behave the way I always had, that I'd stay quiet, that even if something went wrong, the family would circle around her and call it a misunderstanding. That assumption was her biggest mistake. I looked at my parents again. My mother smiled up at Brielle, proud phone still raised. My father nodded slightly, like this was all unfolding exactly as it should. They had no idea how many chances they'd had to stop this without realizing it. No idea how often they'd chosen convenience over accountability. Brielle took a breath, preparing to speak, then paused. Her eyes flicked to my glass again, still full. I saw a flash of irritation cross her face before she smoothed it out. She recovered quickly, lifting her glass a little higher, like she was ready to begin no matter what. That irritation told me something important. She wasn't just hoping I'd drink, she was counting on it. I rested my hand on the table again, closer now to both glasses, feeling the faint vibration from the band's equipment through the floor. The room felt charged like the moment before a storm breaks. I didn't feel nervous, I felt focused. This wasn't about revenge, not yet. It was about control, about deciding whether I would keep playing the role everyone expected, or finally act on what I knew to be true. Brielle cleared her throat, smiling wide, glass raised. "Okay," she said into the microphone, her voice light and confident. "I guess I should start." The room responded with a soft murmur of encouragement. I didn't move my glass. I didn't stop her. I didn't warn anyone. I just watched her stand there, perfectly comfortable, perfectly certain, unaware that every red flag I'd ignored before had finally led us to the same point. And for the first time, I wasn't looking for a way to make this easier for her. The band leader stepped back from the microphone, and the room settled into that quiet, attentive hush that only happens when people expect something pleasant and predictable. I stayed still, my hand resting near the stem of my glass, feeling the smooth tablecloth beneath my fingers. Everything about the reception had been planned to the minute. That wasn't accidental. Years in uniform had trained me to respect logistics, timing, and flow. Weddings might be emotional, but they still run on systems. Seating charts, service schedules, sound checks. When those systems work, people relax, which makes it easier to miss the one thing that doesn't belong. The head table had been arranged carefully. Ethan on my left, Brielle on my right. Not for symbolism, but for practicality, space, sightlines, photographs. I'd learned the hard way that where people sit matters more than they think. Our champagne flutes were identical. Clear crystal, no markings, filled by the same server from the same bottle. Anyone glancing at the table would see nothing unusual. That detail lingered in my mind longer than it should have. I watched a server move between tables, topping off drinks. He paused briefly near us, then continued on. Brielle didn't ask for a refill. Neither did I. She didn't need one. She shifted her weight, slightly settling into her stance. The glass in her hand caught the light. She lifted it just enough to draw attention, but not enough to look impatient. The band leader cleared his throat again. Before dinner continues, we're going to have a few words from the bride's sister. A polite ripple of applause spread through the room. Brielle smiled wider. I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. Not fear, but anticipation. The kind that comes right before something moves from theory to reality. Ethan leaned in, his voice low. "You sure you don't want me to grab you something else to drink?" "No," I said quietly. "I'm good." He nodded, trusting me the way he always had. That trust mattered. It grounded me. Brielle took one step closer to the microphone, then stopped. She glanced down at the glass in her hand, then back at the room. She was enjoying the pause. She liked holding attention. I noticed something else then. Her breathing wasn't as steady as it had been a few minutes earlier. Not fast, just slightly off rhythm. It could have been nerves, or excitement, or something else entirely. I let my gaze drop to the glasses on the table. Mine, hers. Same shape, same level, same sparkle. Anyone watching would assume they were interchangeable. They weren't. The room felt warmer, or maybe I was just more aware of my own body now. My senses sharpened the way they do when something important is about to happen. I could hear the faint hum of the speakers, the clink of cutlery at a distant table, someone coughing softly near the back of the room. Brielle finally spoke. "Hi, everyone." Her voice carried easily, confident, clear. She'd practiced that tone. I'd heard it before in videos she posted online when she wanted to sound heartfelt without committing to anything real. She paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to feel intentional. "I just want to say how grateful I am to be standing here today," she continued. I didn't watch her face. I watched her hands. The way her fingers tightened around the stem of the glass. The way she shifted her weight again like she was grounding herself. Something was starting to feel wrong in a different way now. My phone buzzed once more against my thigh. This time I slid it out just enough to glance at the screen without drawing attention. "Watch her closely," the message read. That wasn't a joke earlier. I slipped the phone away again, pulse steady. I didn't need instructions. I already was. Brielle kept talking, thanking people, naming names, weaving herself into the story of my relationship like she'd been there for every meaningful moment. Some people laughed. Some smiled politely. Most just listened. I felt a flicker of irritation when she talked about how hard the planning process had been for all of us. But I let it pass. This wasn't about correcting her. She lifted her glass a little higher, gesturing with it as she spoke. The liquid inside barely moved. Her grip was careful, deliberate. I realized then that she hadn't taken a sip yet either. That mattered. If she'd expected me to drink by now, she would have already followed. But she was waiting, watching, matching her timing to mine. That was the confirmation I needed. This wasn't a careless act. It was coordinated. She wanted the effect to unfold while people were watching. During the speech, during the toast. I adjusted my chair slightly, the movement small enough to look like a natural shift. My knee brushed the table leg again. My hand moved closer to the base of my glass. Brielle's eyes flicked down for a fraction of a second. She saw it. Her smile tightened, then relaxed. She kept talking. The room leaned in. People love speeches at weddings. They expect warmth. They expect harmless stories. No one expects danger to sit quietly at the head table, naked. I thought briefly about what would happen if I stood up, if I interrupted, if I said something right now. The room would freeze. Questions would follow. Explanations would be demanded. My parents would rush in. Brielle would cry. The pattern would repeat. I wasn't doing that again. Instead, I let my fingers curl around the base of the glass. I didn't lift it. I didn't drink. I just felt its weight, its temperature, the way it anchored me to the table. Brielle reached the end of her opening remarks and laughed softly, glancing around the room. "Okay," she said. "I know you're all waiting for the real part." She raised her glass a little higher now, signaling what was coming. I could feel my heartbeat in my fingertips, steady and controlled. Every variable I needed to consider was already in front of me. The layout, the timing, her attention. I shifted my hand slightly, just enough to brush the stem of her glass as well. She didn't notice, or she thought it was accidental. The room was completely focused on her now. The band stood still. Servers paused mid-step. Even the air seemed to hold. Brielle took a breath, lifting her glass toward her lips. And I made my choice. My fingers slid the glasses without lifting them, the crystal bases whispering against the tablecloth as they traded places so cleanly it looked like nothing had happened at all. I kept my eyes on Brielle's face the entire time, watching for any flicker that told me she'd noticed. She hadn't. Her attention was fixed on the room, on the faces turned toward her, on the moment she believed she controlled. That confidence gave me cover. Confidence always does. I leaned back into my chair, hands returning to my lap, posture relaxed. From the outside, it probably looked like I was settling in to listen to my sister's speech. Inside, every sense stayed locked in. Brielle lifted the glass again, now holding the one she'd prepared for me. She didn't hesitate. That was important. If she'd suspected anything, she would have paused, questioned, checked. She didn't. That confirmed what I already knew. She was operating on certainty, not caution. She believed the night was still following her script. She took a small sip and continued speaking without breaking stride. At first, nothing changed. That's another thing movies get wrong. Things don't happen all at once. There's no instant collapse, no dramatic gasp. Real life moves slower, subtler. Brielle's voice stayed steady as she talked about growing up together, about how proud she was to stand beside me. The words were polished, familiar. I'd heard versions of them before at birthdays and family events where she played the role expected of her. I watched her closely, noting the tiny shifts, the way she blinked a little more often, the way her free hand tightened around the microphone, then loosened again, the way her weight shifted from one foot to the other like the floor had started to feel uneven. Most people wouldn't have noticed. I did. The room stayed with her. People smiled. My mother dabbed at her eyes, already emotional. My father leaned back, arms crossed, satisfied. They heard the tone, not the cracks. Ethan's hand found mine under the table. I squeezed back once a small signal that everything was fine. I wasn't lying. Not anymore. Brielle took another sip, a little larger this time. She laughed softly after, like she was buying herself time. I recognized that move too. Her sentences started running together. Not slurred, just slightly rushed like her thoughts were getting ahead of her mouth. She corrected herself, once waving it off with a joke. Nerves, she said lightly. Guess I should have practiced more. The room laughed with her. I didn't. I thought about how deliberate she'd been earlier. The careful timing, the way she'd watched my glass, the patience. None of this was accidental. That realization didn't make me angry, it made me precise. I glanced briefly toward the edge of the room, where someone I trusted stood watching with the same stillness I felt. Our eyes met for a moment. No nod, no signal, just understanding. Brielle reached the part of the speech where she was supposed to toast us. She lifted the glass again, but this time her arm wavered just enough to catch my attention. She adjusted quickly, smiling wider to cover it. Okay, she said, drawing out the word. So let's raise a glass. She paused, brow furrowing slightly, like she'd lost track of something important. To my sister, she continued. And to Ethan. You two are... She stopped, laughed again too sharply. Wow. That champagne hits fast, she said, earning another ripple of laughter. I watched the color rise in her face. Watched her blink hard like the room was swimming just out of focus. She took another sip, probably thinking it would steady her. It didn't. Her words started to tangle now. Not enough for anyone to jump up or panic. Just enough to feel off. Uncomfortable in a way people didn't know how to name. She cleared her throat. I didn't mean for it to. She stopped, shook her head. Sorry, that's not what I meant. A few confused glances passed between guests. My mother's smile faltered. Brielle laughed again, trying to recover. I mean, tonight's just been... a lot. She raised the glass one more time, but her hand wasn't steady now. The liquid inside trembled visibly. And to you, sis, she said, her voice softening in a way that felt almost sincere. You always handle things so well. Even when you shouldn't have to. That line landed differently. It wasn't part of the script. It slipped out unfiltered, shaped by something deeper than performance. She swallowed again and frowned, her expression briefly confused. I swear she muttered half into the microphone that was supposed to be your glass. The words hung there, not shouted, not announced, just spoken. Clear enough, close enough to the mic that the speakers carried them across the room before she realized what she'd said. The room shifted, not chaos, not panic, just a subtle collective recalibration as people processed what they'd heard. Heads tilted, smiles faded. A few guests glanced at the table, at the glasses, at Brielle. She froze. For the first time all night, she looked truly uncertain. Her eyes darted unfocused, searching for something familiar to grab onto. An explanation. A rescue. I stayed where I was. She tried to laugh it off. I'm kidding, she said quickly. Wow. I really shouldn't be drinking. But her voice betrayed her now. The words came slower, heavier. She leaned into the microphone stand for balance without realizing it. She started again, then stopped, blinking hard. Why does the room feel like it's tilting? That question didn't get a laugh. The band stood frozen. The servers didn't move. The quiet in the room wasn't polite anymore. It was alert. Brielle looked down at the glass in her hand, like it had turned against her. She raised it slightly, then lowered it again, confused. That's weird. She murmured closer to the mic than she meant to be. I didn't even drink that much. Her knees bent slightly, just a fraction. She caught herself gripping the microphone stand tighter now. I saw my father start to rise from his chair. My mother's phone lowered slowly, forgotten. Brielle opened her mouth again, but whatever she meant to say didn't come out. Her face drained of color. The confidence that had carried her this far cracked completely, replaced by something raw and frightened. She took one unsteady step back, then another. The microphone picked up the sound of her breath, shallow and uneven. I remained seated, hands folded, watching the truth work its way through a room that had never expected to see it. Because this was the moment everything shifted. Not loudly, not cleanly, just undeniably. The first thing I noticed was the sound of a chair scraping against the floor, somewhere behind me, followed by the soft thud of a glass being set down too hard. The room hadn't erupted. It had tightened like everyone was holding the same breath and waiting to see who would move first. Brielle tried to straighten, failed, then laughed again, too loud and too late. She lifted one hand as if to wave it off, but the gesture stalled halfway up. Her fingers didn't seem to know where to go. "I'm fine," she said, but the word dragged. "I just need a second." No one answered her. I stayed seated. That choice was deliberate. In the Navy, you're taught that once you escalate a situation, you own everything that follows. Confrontation is loud. It creates size. It invites chaos. Sometimes that's necessary. Most of the time, it's just noise. I hadn't switched the glasses to teach her a lesson. I'd done it because it was the cleanest way to let the truth surface without me becoming the story. If I'd stood up and accused her, the room would have turned on me instantly. Questions would have flown. Emotions would have spiked. My parents would have rushed in demanding explanations, insisting on misunderstandings. Brielle would have cried. Someone would have called it stress. Someone else would have blamed the champagne. I'd seen that script play out too many times. Instead, I let reality speak for itself. Brielle gripped the microphone stand with both hands, now her knuckles white. She tried to focus on the faces in front of her, but her eyes kept sliding off them like the room refused to stay still. Can someone grab me some water?" she asked, her voice thinner. A server stepped forward instinctively, then hesitated, glancing toward the head table, like they weren't sure who to take direction from. The bandleader shifted his weight, looking at the coordinator. My father was on his feet now, halfway out of his chair. "Brielle," he said, his voice sharp with concern. "Sit down." She tried. She missed the chair. Ethan stood immediately. Not rushed, controlled. He moved around the table and reached her just as her knees buckled. He caught her shoulder and guided her down, steadying her the way he'd done 100 times with injured colleagues. The microphone screeched briefly as it tipped, then went quiet. The room exhaled. People started talking at once, but softly, unsure whether they were allowed to. My mother hurried forward, her heels clicking too fast against the floor. She knelt beside Brielle, brushing hair out of her face, panic creeping into her expression. "What did you take?" she whispered too quietly for the room, but not for me. Brielle blinked at her, confused. "I didn't," she said, then frowned. I thought—" She stopped, eyes darting again, unfocused. "I don't feel right." That sentence landed heavier than anything else she'd said. Ethan looked up, scanning her face, checking her pupils, her breathing. "Has she had anything besides champagne?" he asked calmly. My mother shook her head. "Just one glass," she said quickly. She barely drank. I felt the irony of that statement settle into my chest. Ethan nodded once. "We're calling for medical support." "No," my mother said automatically. "It's probably just nerves. Or dehydration." That reflexive dismissal was so familiar, it almost made me laugh. "Call," Ethan repeated, already pulling out his phone. No one argued with him. Authority has a way of cutting through denial. As he stepped away to make the call, Brielle shifted again, groaning softly. My father hovered uselessly, his hands half raised like he wanted to help, but didn't know how. I stayed where I was. Someone finally noticed me then. A guest near the aisle glanced from Brielle to me, then down at the table. Their eyes lingered on the 2 champagne flutes, one full, one nearly empty. The look on their face changed. Another person followed their gaze, then another. It wasn't dramatic. Just a subtle chain reaction, as people connected dots they hadn't known were there. My mother caught the shift and looked up at me sharply. Our eyes met. "What did you drink?" she asked. "Nothing," I said. It was the simplest answer I'd given all night. Her gaze dropped to my untouched glass, then to the one in Brielle's hand, lying on its side near the chair. Her mouth opened, then closed again. For a moment, I thought she might ask the right question. She didn't. Instead, she turned back to Brielle, smoothing her hair again, murmuring reassurances. The instinct to protect kicked in faster than the instinct to understand. That told me everything I needed to know. The coordinator moved in quietly, speaking to the bandleader, signaling for a pause. Servers stepped back. The room reorganized itself around the emergency, but no one told anyone to leave. They were all too curious for that. Brielle's breathing evened out slightly, but her eyes stayed glassy. She muttered something under her breath, barely audible. That wasn't, she said. That wasn't how it was supposed to go. I heard it. So did the microphone still live, still close enough. A few people nearby exchanged looks. I didn't correct her. I didn't clarify. I didn't add context. I'd made my choice earlier, and I was sticking to it. Confronting her would have been about control. Letting this play out was about accountability. Ethan returned phone still in his hand. They're on the way, he said quietly to my parents. She's going to be okay, but she needs to be checked. My father nodded stiffly, his face pale. He finally looked at me again, really looked at me this time, like he was seeing me as part of the situation instead of background support. I met his gaze without flinching. I wasn't angry. I wasn't smug. I was done. As they helped Brielle to a more comfortable position, the room stayed hushed eyes flicking between her and the table, between the glasses, between the story everyone thought they were attending and the one unfolding in front of them. I folded my hands together and waited, because the hardest part wasn't over yet. Not for her, and not for the family that had spent years pretending this kind of thing couldn't happen right in front of them. The EMTs moved with quiet efficiency, kneeling beside Brielle, asking simple questions in calm voices. She tried to answer them, but her words lagged behind her thoughts, each sentence arriving a beat too late. "What's your name?" one of them asked. She frowned, then said it correctly, like she was relieved she still could. They checked her pulse. Her blood pressure shined a small light into her eyes. The room watched in near silence now, curiosity overtaking celebration. No one reached for their drinks anymore. I stayed seated, my back straight, hands folded loosely in my lap. From where I was, I could see everything without being in the way. That felt intentional too. One of the EMTs glanced toward the head table, eyes lingering on the glasses. "Did she consume alcohol tonight?" he asked, projecting his voice just enough. "Yes," my mother said quickly, "just champagne." "How much?" My mother hesitated. "Not much." The EMT nodded once, then looked back at Brielle. "Did you take anything else? Medication supplements?" Brielle shook her head, then winced, pressing her fingers to her temple. "No. I mean..." She stopped, swallowing hard. "I didn't think it would..." Her voice trailed off. The EMT leaned closer. "Didn't think what would what?" She squeezed her eyes shut. "I don't know. It wasn't supposed to be like this." That sentence hit the room harder than any accusation could have. A few people gasped softly. Someone near the back murmured, "What does she mean?" The EMT straightened slightly. "Ma'am, did you put something in your drink?" Brielle opened her eyes confused, then shook her head again. "No. I mean..." Her brow furrowed. "I put it in the other one." The words came out slurred, unfiltered, amplified by the microphone that no one had turned off. A wave moved through the room. Not noise, recognition. My mother's face drained of color. "Brielle," she whispered sharply. "Stop talking." But it was too late. The EMT exchanged a look with his partner. The other one he repeated calmly. Brielle lifted her hand weakly, pointing toward the table. Toward me. Toward the untouched glass. "That was supposed to be hers," she said, frustration creeping into her voice. "I didn't mean to drink it." The room broke then, not into shouting, into whispers. People turning to each other, connecting the dots they hadn't wanted to see. Heads swiveling between me and Brielle. Eyes dropping again to the glasses. Ethan stepped back toward me, his hand finding mine under the table. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. One of the EMTs gently guided Brielle to sit back against the chair, his tone still professional. "What did you put in the drink?" She frowned again, clearly struggling to focus. "It was just something to calm her down," she said. "She's always so tense." That justification hung in the air, ugly and unmistakable. My father took a step back, like the floor beneath him had shifted. "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice unsteady. Brielle looked at him, irritation flashing through the haze. "I didn't want her to make a scene," she said. "Everyone's always watching her. I just wanted her to loosen up." The EMT didn't react to the content. He reacted to the implication. "Do you know what you gave her?" he asked. Brielle shrugged weakly. "Just something from my bag. It's not a big deal." That was when the second EMT spoke. "We're going to take her in to be evaluated," he said, already signaling for the stretcher. "This is no longer a wedding issue. This is a medical one." The word medical landed differently than emergency. It stripped the situation of denial. As they moved Brielle onto the stretcher, she started to cry, the sound thin and disoriented. My mother hovered uselessly, wringing her hands, trying to soothe her with the same phrases she'd used my entire life. It's okay, everything's fine." Nothing was fine. As they rolled her toward the exit, Brielle's eyes found mine one last time. There was no apology there. No regret. Just confusion and resentment, like she couldn't understand how her plan had turned against her. I didn't look away. The doors closed behind them, and the room was left with the aftermath. Half-drunk glasses, a microphone still lying on its side, a celebration that had fractured beyond repair. Someone finally turned the mic off. The silence afterward was heavier than anything that had come before. The coordinator approached Ethan quietly, asking if we wanted to pause or end the reception. He glanced at me before answering. I stood then, not dramatically, just enough to draw attention. "We'll take a short break," I said. My voice carried without the mic. "Clear, steady. Please give us a few minutes." People nodded automatically, relieved to be given direction. The structure returned, even if the mood didn't. Conversations resumed in low tones. Guests stepped outside for air. Servers moved again, collecting abandoned glasses. My parents stood frozen near the aisle. My mother looked at me like she wanted to speak, but didn't know what to say that wouldn't make things worse. My father avoided my eyes entirely. Ethan leaned in. "Are you okay?" I nodded. "I am." And I was. Not because what had happened wasn't painful, but because it was finally honest. As the room slowly reset itself, I noticed how many people avoided my parents now, how many avoided the table altogether. The story had already shifted in their minds, even without details. I sat back down, smoothing my dress, watching the small, ordinary movements return to the space. The music would start again soon. The night would continue, just altered. I felt lighter than I had in years, because for the first time, the truth hadn't been buried to protect someone else. It had surfaced on its own, loud enough that no one could pretend they hadn't heard it. And whatever came next, it wouldn't be built on silence. The music came back on quietly, like the band was testing whether it was allowed to exist again. A few guests returned to their seats. Others lingered near the doors, pretending to check their phones while replaying what they'd just witnessed. Nothing about the room felt the same, but it wasn't frozen either. Life has a way of continuing, even when the script changes mid-scene. Ethan sat beside me again, his presence solid and grounding. He didn't ask questions. He didn't push for explanations. He'd seen enough to understand the shape of it. My parents approached slowly, as if speed might make things worse. My mother spoke first. "She didn't mean to hurt you," she said, voice tight, already defending. "She's under a lot of pressure. You know how she is." I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt something quiet click into place. "I know exactly how she is," I said. "That's the problem." My father cleared his throat. "We'll talk about this later," he said, trying to sound authoritative, like this was something he could still manage. "No," I said, "we won't." The word landed harder than I expected. Not because it was loud, but because it was final. They both stared at me, unprepared for that response. For years later had been my default. Later meant postponing conflict. Later meant absorbing damage so no one else had to. There was no later left. Ethan stood then, not as a shield but as a partner. "We're going to continue our reception," he said calmly. "If you'd like to stay, you're welcome. If not, that's okay too." It wasn't a dismissal, it was a boundary. My parents hesitated, unsure which option preserved their dignity best. In the end, they chose distance. They murmured something about checking on Brielle and moved toward the exit, their urgency finally real now that there was no one left to smooth things over. As they left, I noticed something I hadn't expected. No one followed them. People stayed. Friends, colleagues, even family members who'd watched the same dynamic play out for years and never had the words for it. They didn't crowd us. They didn't demand details. They just stayed, and that felt like quiet confirmation. The coordinator returned, asking softly if we wanted to adjust the schedule. I glanced at Ethan. He smiled. "Let's keep going," I said. And we did. Dinner resumed. The band picked up tempo. Laughter crept back in, tentative, at first, then more natural. The night didn't reset. It evolved. A few people came up to me individually. No questions, just brief comments. "I'm glad you're okay. That must have been a lot. You handled that well." Each one felt like a small release of something I'd been carrying for years. Later, as the dance floor filled, I let myself breathe fully for the first time that day. Not because everything was perfect, but because nothing was hidden anymore. Ethan pulled me into a slow dance, his hand steady at my back. "You don't owe anyone explanations," he said quietly. I know I said, and I meant it. We didn't talk about Brielle again that night. There was nothing left to say. The truth had already done its work. The days that followed were quieter than I expected. Brielle was kept overnight for observation. The hospital noted the interaction between alcohol and a sedative. No one called it an accident. No one had to. My parents called me the next morning. I let it go to voicemail. They called again that evening, and the next day. When I finally listened to the messages, they sounded exactly like they always had. Confused, defensive, more concerned with managing fallout than understanding cause. I didn't return the calls. That decision wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with anger or tears, it came with relief. I blocked the numbers a week later after one final message from my mother that ended with "family forgives." I didn't reply. Forgiveness isn't the same as access. The military understands that distinction better than most families do. Trust is built on accountability. When someone proves they can't be trusted, you don't keep putting them in positions where damage is inevitable. I applied that same principle to my life. Months passed, then more. Ethan and I settled into routines that felt earned instead of negotiated. Mornings without tension. Holidays without rehearsed conversations. A future that didn't require me to stay on alert. I stayed in the Navy. I took on more responsibility. Not because I needed validation, but because I finally had the space to grow without interference. Every now and then, I'd hear updates through extended family. Brielle was working on herself. Brielle was doing better. Brielle was still the center of every explanation. Nothing had changed there. But something had changed in me. I no longer felt the pull to fix it, or her, or them. One evening, long after the wedding had faded into memory for everyone else, Ethan and I sat on our porch, watching the light disappear from the sky. He asked me if I regretted how things ended. I thought about it for a moment. "No," I said. "I regret how long I protected a version of her that never existed." He nodded like that made perfect sense. Walking away wasn't punishment. It was maintenance. The kind that keeps systems from failing entirely. My sister had made her choice. My family had made theirs. For the first time, I had made mine too. And I didn't need a toast, a confession, or an audience to know it was the right one. If this story resonated with you, especially if you've lived through family betrayal or complicated family dynamics, consider subscribing to the channel. I share real stories like this, honest, uncomfortable, and grounded in real life, because sometimes hearing them helps you make sense of your own.